Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. Hope everyone has had a great summer. It's been a fairly quiet period in the art world with very few new gallery shows, museum exhibitions, or auctions. But that, of course, will change very soon with both the Armory Show and Free Soul kicking off in early September, along with the opening of several gallery shows really from around the world. I often receive messages from artists about their careers. Many are still in school or have just graduated, and they're seeking advice on how to gain traction and bring more attention to their practice. And while I always enjoy those conversations and try to share advice, I have noticed that these kinds of discussions don't happen very openly in the art world. More often, artists rely on each other for guidance, since there seems to be this sort of unspoken wall between artists and collectors where conversations are supposed to stay at the level of polite compliments rather than diving into the realities of the market or the career of artists. And from what I've gathered, even top MFA programs rarely provide much practical career advice and instead focus almost exclusively on the art making itself. And so that's why I was so interested in a recent article that came out in Artnet News by Jo Lawson-Tancred, one of their news reporters. In it, she gathers valuable advice for artists from curators and other successful artists about what it really takes to stand out and build a career. I thought it was worth inviting Jo on the podcast to expand on some of these insights. I think the conversation is especially useful for artists, but it's also a great listen for anyone in the art world. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Jo, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, I really enjoyed your article on Artnet News, and I thought it provided a lot of great advice for rising artists. And if our listeners haven't had a chance to check it out yet, I definitely recommend they do. I'm curious, what prompted you to write this article at this moment? With Instagram and other social media, one could argue that artists are discovered earlier in their careers than ever before. But despite that, why do you think it's still such a challenge for a rising artist to get noticed?
Yeah, well, the article kind of came out of some other articles I've been working on. So at the beginning of this year, I published also on Artnet a kind of deep dive into small museums that are very impactful and influential, more so than you would think for their size. So maybe they're really good at spotting emerging talent and they have really proactive curators. And in that sense, by kind of selecting the artists that they then project onto big institutional moments, they're kind of setting the agenda for the art world. And then we became interested in how curators are doing that search, curators whose practices we respect. What are they looking for in new artists? And so I had an article come out in June on that, but I was speaking to probably about six leading curators, and there was so much material to work with. And on the cutting room floor of that article, there was just what I felt like was really interesting advice. So we kind of from that decided to do a follow-up article because I felt like artists need to hear this. It's really useful. And I do think, I guess really, it's just that there's so many emerging artists who want to have opportunities and get recognized that obviously makes it so competitive and tough. And I think for that reason, one thing that I think is quite useful about the article I wrote with advice from curators is it talks not just about getting noticed, but also what to do with an opportunity once you get it. How can you use it to its fullest advantage and not kind of lose it?
Yeah, and something I've been saying for a while to artists is that for better or worse, it's really about more than just making your art. Maybe there's a handful of artists early in their career that can solely focus on making art in their studio and somehow, some way, the promotion of their work, the marketing of it, the networking, it's all being taken care of, or fortuitously everything just falls right into place and they don't have to worry about that. But I think that's the exception to the rule rather than the rule. And a big takeaway from your piece is that being an artist now means wearing many hats. And that's something I've shared in terms of advice with artists, from networking to marketing to self promotion. How essential is that entrepreneurial mindset for building a sustainable career?
Yeah, I think it's really, really important, perhaps unfortunately, because it goes against romantic notions of an artist just lost in our studio. But one way that I've got some insight from this is I've been lucky to interview some artists who have been recognized quite young. They're doing really well. And when I'm profiling them, asking them a lot of questions about, and then these people have had quite short careers, so getting quite a good deep dive into like how they've gone from art school to maybe being represented by a really high profile gallery in less than a decade sometimes. Of course, there's elements of luck, and obviously there's a lot of talent, but I have always been struck by an artist's ability to promote themselves. And one example that I thought was quite interesting, I was talking to a young woman painter who's now, I think, in her early 30s, represented by a blue chip top mega gallery. And she got an opportunity to put on a show in a local museum. And rather than just have her own works, she loaned a bunch of works, I think, like from artists that had bigger names than her, and perhaps even some like interesting museum pieces, kind of art historical pieces, because she knew that that would bring a much wider interest to the show than just her name that at that time wasn't very big. And actually, she then got a much bigger kind of kind of stepping stone gallery representation because the gallerist came to see that show because of the other artists that were included. So I felt that was such an interesting example of this kind of strategic thinking about how artists position themselves to gain more attention to their work.
Yeah, I think that's a really great anecdote. And it actually reminds me of an artist who I'm friends with. After several years, they finally got their first museum show. And when the news came out, I asked them, how did this come about? Tell me all about it. And they said that they actually attended a gallery dinner, I believe it was. It wasn't for their show, but for an artist that they were friends with. And they happened to be seated next to a curator, and they started a dialogue, and the dialogue evolved over several months, and the curator actually offered them a museum exhibition, which was really incredible. Now, not to say that every dinner an artist goes to is going to lead to a show, let alone a museum show. And of course, you go to some dinners and nothing comes of it. In fact, most of the time that's the case. But the more opportunities you create for yourself by attending these types of events, it increases your luck and increases the chances that you will strike up a conversation with someone, and who knows what will come from that. And so many of the curators you spoke to in your article, they seem to emphasize the importance of this, of building relationships. In your view, is networking the single most important factor in getting discovered today? And what are some of the ways to most effectively, proactively network if you're an artist?
I think, yeah, it probably is the most important factor. The head of exhibitions at Queen's Museum said, as she's quoted in the piece, you can't just sit in the studio and wait for someone to come and discover you. And I think, unfortunately, that is true. But what I thought was probably the most interesting thing that came out of the conversations was the importance of a peer network. So artists knowing other artists. And that, I mean, every curator I spoke to, all of them said that they'd learned about new artists being recommended by artists. And also, if you think about it, that would be a great way to get included in a group show if your work was relevant and other artists knew about you. And speaking from my own experience, having been a freelance writer before I worked for Artnet News, I think there was a period where I was probably skeptical about the use of peers because you feel like you're in competition with them and like surely, they're not necessarily trying to help you, they're trying to help themselves. But actually, a lot of the biggest jobs I've ever gotten freelance were through peers I befriended who were passing off work or people who'd recommended me word of mouth. So yeah, in terms of networking, I always find when you're very young, kind of mainly still at university or school, the way people talk about it, it's like you're going to have to launch yourself across the room at someone really important, and it's going to require a lot of bravery and be kind of scary and possibly embarrassing. But in my experience, it's always felt quite natural. So I just try to be generous about sharing contacts with people in the hope that they might, return the favor at some point. Organizing social things, even if it's just drinks after an opening. Yeah, I think, but it really, if you're lucky enough to work in an industry where you like most of the people you meet, I think it can happen quite naturally if you just, as the curators say, get out of the studio.
Well, speaking of the networking effect, I can't recall if you touched on this in your article at all, but I'm curious your thoughts. When I sometimes speak with artists who are not based in some of the major art capitals like New York, London, etc., and they're asking for advice, one thing I tell them is, you're a young artist. If you really want to go all in on this and try to make a career out of this, I think it's very beneficial to consider moving to one of those centers like New York or London because of that network effect, because of being around other artists, being around galleries. So many great opportunities can happen simply by being there, being physically present. But if you're not there, you're potentially missing out on so much of this.
Yeah, I think that is hard. I suppose residencies would probably be quite useful in that kind of a situation. But I think that's a problem. Yeah, it is tough if you're more local. I guess maybe you have to use the internet more as well.
Yeah, I definitely think the internet can help with that to some degree, but I still think being physically there, it's irreplaceable. So, one of the tips you share in your article is about having an organized and professional presentation, from a clear portfolio to an artist statement. What do you think are maybe some of the most common mistakes that artists do make here? And what really makes a presentation at the end of the day stand out to curators?
Yeah, so when I was talking to curators about this question, kind of how they do their research, and in that respect, how do they find new artists, especially online? That was where I felt as a journalist I had a lot of overlap and empathy with our experience because similarly, if I'm trying to write something quite quickly, I mean, even if maybe you have a few different things you could write about and you're on a deadline, the thing where there's a lot of information that's easily presented and organized is the thing that you're then going to give your attention to because everyone's in a rush. So I understood what they were saying, and they were, of course, saying, there's so many people they could be looking at all the time, and they don't have time to have 50 different tabs open. So I think, yeah, the clear thing is compiling everything in one place, making sure it's easy to access. I guess probably starting from a point where you think about the perspective of someone who's researching you, who knows nothing about you, and what information they would need, but also what order it would be intuitive to read that information in. And certainly, every curator, I think, or most of them said they were really keen to see a sense of development and chronology. So things organized into series, an awareness of the context that you're working in. So, yeah, absolutely an artist statement. Even I think something like artist statements, maybe in short paragraphs, thinking about how you're organizing the information so it's intuitive. Again, that's something that I learned from writing news stories, how to kind of make things legible, keep people's eyes on the page. Artists can like quite gimmicky, flashy website effects, which I think can be fun, but should not come at the expense of it being navigable. But another thing, which I think was probably all of the curators said, was very much about the message. They wanted the sense that they were getting a clear message about what the work means, why the artist is committed to it, the urgency of it. And one thing I note in the article, because I think it does connect to this, obviously, there's been a lot of discourse recently about whether or not art needs to have a political message or some kind of identity driven factor, kind of the discourse around Dean Kissack's essay. And what I certainly, when I was talking to curators, a lot of them do kind of look for that. But I didn't, I think some of them, on the whole, what they're really looking for is a coherent message and why an artist is committed to this line of inquiry, how they've developed their thinking on it and making that clear. So it doesn't necessarily have to be super political or, or maybe like a topic of the day. I just think as long as you can show why it's important to you, curators really respond to that.
Joe, I think all of this is really helpful and practical information for artists and really interesting for people who aren't artists, but in the art world to whatever capacity they are to hear this. Is there any other advice that you touched on in the article that you wanted to share?
Yes, absolutely. So, I think the other really interesting thing that came out of it, because I suppose that when you're an artist, you're so keen to get any opportunity you can. And I think something that, like curators that I was speaking to, they said it's all about the timing and finding the right time for a certain project with an artist. And the artist should really be honest about what else they have on, how much time they can commit to a project, how ready they are for it. Because if you do rush something and you do it at the wrong time and maybe you're trying to balance it with something else, it would be worse in a way to jeopardize that, sort of get halfway through on a project and it collapse because you weren't actually able to give your time to it. I think curators work with artists, even that they haven't necessarily worked on a project with, but if they're interested in artist work, they might stay in contact with an artist for many years before they actually work with them on a project. And now just watching and waiting for the right time. So I think if you meet a curator, you don't need to rush that relationship. You can just keep them kind of aware of what you're working on, and they'll really appreciate if you're honest about your limitations when discussing a potential project. And the other key thing, which I think is very related to this, kind of on the theme of honesty, is being aware, showing an awareness of the practicalities of, because we all like to imagine like a big exciting project and run at it with ambition, but proposals should include thoughts about budget, working timeline, materials, and also probably like an openness to flexibility to show that if something isn't working out, you're not going to kind of insist really rigidly on an original plan, but that you want to work collaboratively with a curator to work on something that's feasible. And that's probably the best way, really, to, like I was saying before, make the best use of opportunities as they come up with, build a good relationship with a curator that could last for a long time. And again, like maybe then that curator will feel confident referring you to another curator, knowing that it's a great experience working with you.
Joe, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast and sharing some of the advice that you highlight in your article in Artnet News. If our listeners haven't read it yet, I definitely recommend they do. The title of the article is Waiting to be Discovered. Curators Reveal How Emerging Artists Can Get Noticed, and it's available to read now on Artnet. And if our listeners don't follow you on social media already, where can we find you there?
Yeah, Joe Lawson-Tancred with nothing in between those words on Instagram, I'd say is the best place.
Perfect. Thanks so much again, Joe. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Adam.